News convicted killer Joseph Corcoran of Fort Wayne is dead. His execution was carried out early this morning.
Now, Corcoran was convicted and sentenced to death for the 1997 murders of his brother, his sister's fiance, and two of their friends. And according to court records, Corcoran shot all four with a rifle. He said he was stressed because his sister was going to have to move out of their shared Fort Wayne home, and he heard the four talking about him.
After 25 years on death row, a man who killed 4 people in front of his 7-year-old niece said just 5 words before his execution. Let's get this over with. But here's what nobody expected. He had already gotten away with murder once before, and the police knew it. The man's name was Joseph Edward Corcoran. When he was only 16 years old in 1992, his parents were found dead in their home, killed with a shotgun. Joseph was accused of the murders, but the jury said there wasn't enough proof. He walked free. The case was never solved. 5 years later, on a warm Saturday afternoon in July 1997, Joseph was upstairs in the house he shared with his older brother, James. 4 men were downstairs eating pizza and watching television. James was there with his friend Robert, who was engaged to Joseph's sister, Kelly. 2 more friends, Timothy and Douglas, had stopped by to visit. Joseph woke from a nap and heard voices below. In his mind, something dark took hold. He believed they were talking about him, about what happened to his parents. The thought consumed him until he couldn't take it anymore. He went to the attic and grabbed his rifle. Then he walked to where his 7-year-old niece was playing. He took her hand, led her to another room, and told her to stay there. Don't come out for any reason. It was the only act of mercy in what came next. Joseph walked downstairs with the rifle and opened fire. James fell first, then Robert. Timothy was shot before he could stand. Douglas ran to the kitchen, but Joseph chased him and shot him in the head. 4 men dead in minutes. Joseph set the rifle down, walked outside, and knocked on the neighbor's door. "Call 911, he said calmly. "I just shot them." Then he sat on his front porch and waited for the police. When officers searched his room, they found an arsenal, more than 30 guns, homemade explosives, military manuals, diagrams on the wall showing shooting positions. This wasn't a moment of anger. It was something he had been preparing for. Joseph was charged with 4 counts of murder. At his trial in 1999, psychiatrists said he suffered from paranoid schizophrenia. His mind was broken, but they also said he knew the difference between right and wrong when he pulled the trigger. The jury found him guilty. He was sentenced to death. For 25 years, Joseph sat on death row. He didn't want appeals. He didn't want lawyers fighting for him. In 2003, he asked the courts to stop trying to save his life. He wanted to die, but the law required review after review. The Indiana Supreme Court looked at his case 7 times. The U.S. Supreme Court reviewed it 3 times. Every time the answer was the same. The sentence stands. On December 18, 2024, at age 49, Joseph was moved to the execution chamber. His final meal was Ben & Jerry's ice cream. Nothing else. When asked if he had any last words, he said quietly, "Not really. Let's get this over with." At 12:44 in the morning, he was pronounced dead. It was Indiana's first execution in 15 years. Fort Wayne, Indiana, July 1997. 4 men sat together in a living room, eating pizza and watching TV. Upstairs, 1 man lay on his bedroom floor, listening to their laughter drift through the house. In 15 minutes, all 4 would be dead. And the killer? He would walk outside and calmly ask the neighbor to call 911. James Corcoran was 30 years old, the hard-working oldest brother everyone relied on. He had taken on the responsibility of keeping the family together after everything they had been through. Robert Scott Turner was 32, recently engaged to Kelly, James's sister. He was planning his wedding and had just moved into the house, excited about starting a new chapter of his life. Timothy Bricker and Douglas Stillwell were both 30. They had been friends with James since elementary school, the kind of friends who stopped by on Saturday afternoons just to hang out and share a meal. These weren't statistics. They were brothers, friends, future husbands. They were men who thought Saturday meant pizza and football. Men who never imagined that an ordinary afternoon could turn into their last. It was Saturday, July 26, 1997. The American summer was at its peak. Across the nation, Puff Daddy and Faith Evans dominated every radio station with their emotional tribute song, "I'll Be Missing You." Movie theaters were packed with people watching Will Smith save the world in Men in Black. On the evening news, anchors excitedly discussed the Pathfinder mission that was sending stunning photographs back from the surface of Mars. The world felt alive with possibility. But inside one house in Fort Wayne, Indiana, death was waking up. In Fort Wayne, a quiet city in northeastern Indiana, the afternoon heat hung heavy in the air. Inside the modest two-story house at 1602 Bayer Avenue, life seemed to follow its usual Saturday rhythm. The television hummed in the background. Pizza boxes sat open on the coffee table. Four men relaxed in the living room, talking and laughing about nothing in particular. They had no idea they were living the final hour of their lives. They had no idea that upstairs, someone they trusted was about to become their executioner. Upstairs, 22-year-old Joseph Edward Corcoran lay on the floor of his bedroom, his eyes open and staring at the ceiling. He had been napping but woke to the sound of voices drifting up from below. Male voices, laughter, conversation. Words he couldn't quite make out but could hear clearly enough to send ice through his veins. In most homes, this would mean nothing. Brothers and friends gathering. Normal life unfolding. But Joseph's mind didn't work like most people's minds. Something had broken inside him years ago. Maybe when he was a child, enduring punishment he thought was too harsh. Maybe when his parents burned his music tapes. Maybe when he stood trial for their murders and saw the doubt in people's eyes even after he was acquitted. Whatever it was, that broken thing had grown into something monstrous. The voices weren't just talking. In Joseph's diseased mind, they were talking about him, about secrets that should have stayed buried, about what happened 5 years ago with his parents, Jack and Catherine, found dead with shotgun blasts in their quiet home near Ball Lake. About how he had been accused of paying a classmate $200 and a shotgun to kill them. About how he had somehow walked free from that courtroom even though everyone suspected he had done it. The thought began as a whisper in his mind, then grew into a roar. They're discussing me. They know what I did. They're probably planning to turn me in. Or maybe they're laughing at me. Paranoia wrapped around his thoughts like barbed wire, tightening with every passing second, cutting into his reason until there was nothing left but raw, bleeding fear and rage. His heart pounded against his ribs like something trying to escape. His breathing quickened. The walls of his room seemed to pulse inward, suffocating him. Joseph stood up. The voices below continued, oblivious to the storm brewing upstairs. He moved through the hallway with terrible purpose, his mind made up about what needed to happen next. But here's the terrifying part, the part that would haunt investigators for decades. This wasn't his first time planning murder. 5 years earlier, when he was just 17 years old, he had been acquitted of killing his own parents with a shotgun. The jury said there wasn't enough evidence to convict him, but the shadow of suspicion had followed him ever since, darkening every room he entered. Now, at 22 years old, that darkness was about to consume 4 more lives. Joseph made his way to the attic, the one space in the house that was entirely his kingdom, his fortress, his tomb. Inside, he kept an arsenal that would later shock even the most experienced police officers. More than 30 firearms lined the walls like trophies. Boxes of ammunition were stacked in corners. Homemade explosives sat on shelves. Military tactics manuals lay open on a table. Hand-drawn diagrams covered the walls, showing defensive positions and firing angles, escape routes and kill zones. This wasn't the room of someone who snapped in a moment of rage. It was the war room of someone who had been planning for violence, preparing for battle, waiting for the voices in his head to give the final order. He selected his weapon with the care of a craftsman choosing his tool, a Ruger Mini 14 semi-automatic rifle. Powerful, deadly, efficient. The cold metal felt right in his hands, like it had always belonged there. Before descending the stairs, Joseph paused. A flicker of something, maybe the last ember of his humanity, made him think of his 7-year-old niece playing somewhere upstairs. She was innocent, pure, completely unaware that her uncle had transformed into something barely human. In what would later be described as the only act of mercy in an otherwise merciless massacre, Joseph walked to where the little girl played with her dolls, lost in a child's imagination where bad things only happen in stories. He took her small warm hand in his cold one and led her gently down the hallway to a room farther away from the stairs. A room where she wouldn't see, where the sounds might be muffled just enough to spare her young mind some of the horror about to unfold. "Stay here," he told her quietly, his voice flat and emotionless. "Don't come out for any reason. No matter what you hear, stay right here and don't open this door." The little girl nodded, confused but obedient, sensing something wrong in her uncle's eyes but too young to name it. Joseph closed the door behind him, sealing her away from the nightmare. That child would never see her uncle again as a free man, and she would never see her father alive again. She would grow up carrying the weight of that afternoon, forever wondering if there was something she could have said or done to stop what happened next. Joseph gripped the rifle and walked down the stairs. Each step brought him closer to the living room, where four men sat completely unaware that death was approaching on quiet feet. The television continued playing some forgotten show. The pizza grew cold in its box, grease congealing on the cardboard. Glasses sat half full on the table, condensation sliding down their sides. It was a frozen moment of peace, the last breath before the storm, about to shatter into a horror that would scar Fort Wayne forever. The four men never heard him coming. James Corcoran, the 30-year-old older brother who had tried to help Joseph even when others had given up on him, who had let him live in this house, who had defended him when people whispered about their parents' murders. Robert Scott Turner, the 32-year-old fiancé planning a wedding with Joseph's sister Kelly, a man excited about his future, about building a family, about all the ordinary beautiful things that make life worth living. Timothy Bricker, 30 years old, a childhood friend of James, who had stopped by just to hang out, who had no connection to Joseph's demons, who was simply in the wrong place at the wrong time. Douglas Stillwell, also 30, another longtime friend who thought Saturday meant pizza and television and good company, who would never make it home to his own family. Joseph stepped into the living room doorway. He raised the rifle. For a brief second, perhaps less than a heartbeat, there might have been confusion on their faces, a moment where their brains tried to process what they were seeing. Why is Joseph holding a gun? Why is it pointed at us? This must be a joke. This can't be real. What's happening? Then the shots began. The sound was deafening in the enclosed space, sharp cracks that split the air and shattered the afternoon calm, leaving ears ringing and reality broken. James fell first, struck before he could even register what was happening, betrayed by his own brother in his own home. Robert was next, his body collapsing on the couch where he'd been sitting moments ago, dreaming about his wedding day. Timothy tried to stand, tried to react, but the bullets came too fast, too close. He was shot at point-blank range, so close there was no chance of survival, no time for prayer or final thoughts. Douglas's instinct was to run. His body moved before his mind could fully process the horror unfolding around him. He leaped from the couch and sprinted toward the kitchen, desperate for any escape, any way out of this nightmare. But Joseph was faster, fueled by whatever twisted purpose drove him. He chased his brother's friend through the house, the rifle still smoking in his hands, his face showing no expression, no humanity, nothing but cold determination. In the kitchen, with nowhere left to run and nowhere to hide, Douglas was shot in the head. He fell to the floor like a puppet with cut strings, and the house went silent. 4 men, 15 minutes, all of them dead, all of them murdered by someone they knew, someone they trusted, someone who sat at their tables and shared their lives. The living room was a scene from hell. Bodies slumped on furniture in positions no living person could hold. Blood splattered on walls and pooled on carpet, still warm, still spreading. The acrid smell of gunpowder hung thick in the air, mixing with the scent of cooling pizza that no one would ever finish eating, creating a sickening combination that would haunt the first responders for years. The television kept playing, laugh tracks from some sitcom echoing through a room where laughter had just died forever. Shell casings littered the floor, small brass evidence of the violence that had erupted like a volcano, sudden and consuming. Joseph set the rifle down carefully on the floor. He didn't panic. He didn't run. He didn't shake or cry or show any sign that he had just ended 4 human lives. His movements were calm, almost mechanical. as if he had just completed some mundane household task. He walked out the front door, across the small yard where grass still grew and flowers still bloomed, oblivious to the horror, and over to his neighbor's house. The evening air was warm and still. Somewhere nearby, a dog barked. Children played in another yard. Life continued normally for everyone else in the neighborhood, completely unaware that everything at 1602 Bayer Avenue had just changed forever. Joseph knocked on the neighbor's door. When the woman answered, expecting perhaps a request to borrow sugar or a friendly chat, he looked at her with eyes that showed no emotion, no tears, no fear, no regret, nothing human behind them at all. "Call 911, he said calmly, as if he were reporting a broken water pipe or a fallen tree. "I just shot them." The neighbor's face went pale. Her mouth opened, but no sound came out. Her hands began to shake. She couldn't process what she was hearing, couldn't reconcile the calm young man at her door with the words he had just spoken. Joseph didn't wait for her response. He had delivered his message. He turned and walked back to his house with the same steady pace, climbed the steps to the front porch, and sat down in a chair. He placed his hands on his knees, stared out at the quiet street where nothing had changed, where the world kept turning as if 4 men hadn't just been slaughtered, and waited for the police to arrive. And as he sat there in the fading afternoon light, somewhere upstairs behind a closed door, a 7-year-old girl waited too, not knowing why, not understanding what the sounds had meant, not yet aware that her childhood had just ended and her nightmares were only beginning. When detectives entered Joseph's room, they stopped breathing. What they found wasn't just evidence. It was a window into a mind preparing for war. It was proof that evil doesn't always announce itself with screams and chaos. Sometimes it plans quietly, methodically, drawing diagrams in the dark. The police arrived at 1602 Bayer Avenue within minutes of the neighbor's frantic 911 call. They found Joseph exactly where he said he'd be, sitting calmly on the front porch like a man waiting for a bus. He didn't resist. He didn't run. He simply stood when told to stand, turned when told to turn, and allowed the handcuffs to click around his wrists without a word of protest. His clothes were clean, no visible blood, no sign of struggle. Just a young man who looked like he'd been sitting peacefully all afternoon. But inside the house, peace had been murdered along with the 4 men. The officers who entered first would never forget what they saw. The living room looked like a battlefield. Bodies sprawled in positions that defied natural rest. Blood painted the walls in arterial sprays that told stories of terror and sudden violence. The kitchen floor was slick with it. Shell casings littered the carpet like obscene confetti. And through it all, the television kept playing, its canned laughter echoing through rooms where real laughter would never sound again. After securing the scene and removing Joseph's 7-year-old niece from upstairs, unharmed but forever changed, the investigators began their grim work. They photographed everything, measured everything, documented the trajectory of every bullet, the position of every body, the placement of every piece of evidence. And then they climbed the stairs to Joseph's bedroom. They expected a mess. Maybe some evidence of drug use or alcohol, perhaps signs of a sudden breakdown, a mind that had snapped without warning. What they found instead made their blood run cold. The bedroom was neat, almost military in its organization. But it was what lay beyond, in the attic that only Joseph could access, that transformed this from a tragic shooting into something far more sinister. When they opened the attic door, they entered a world that shouldn't exist in a residential neighborhood, a world that belonged in war zones and terrorist cells, not in a house on Bayer Avenue where families lived and children played. More than 30 firearms lined the walls and filled corners. Not hunting rifles passed down from grandfathers or pistols for home defense. These were weapons of war. Semi-automatic rifles, high-capacity magazines, enough ammunition to supply a small army. The collection wasn't random or haphazard. It was curated, maintained, ready for use at a moment's notice. But the guns were just the beginning. Homemade explosives sat on shelves, their components carefully labeled and organized. Military tactics manuals lay open on a makeshift desk, pages worn from repeated reading, passages underlined and annotated, books about guerrilla warfare, guides to urban combat, instructions for creating defensive positions and planning offensive strikes, and among them, a copy of the Turner Diaries, a notorious text that had inspired domestic terrorists and extremists for decades. The walls told their own horrifying story. Hand-drawn diagrams covered nearly every surface, firing positions mapped out with mathematical precision, angles of attack calculated down to the degree, defensive strategies for holding a house against siege, escape routes marked in red ink. This wasn't the room of someone who had lost control. This was the headquarters of someone who had been planning, preparing, and waiting for the moment when paranoia would give way to action. One detective stood in the center of that attic for a long time, just staring. This wasn't a crime of passion. This wasn't a sudden snap. This was premeditated, planned. Joseph Edward Corcoran had been building toward this moment for months, maybe years. The four men downstairs had never stood a chance. They were targets long before they walked through the door that afternoon. But the true shock, the revelation that sent ripples through the entire investigation, came when they ran Joseph's name through the system. At first, they expected a clean record, maybe some minor offenses, perhaps a history of mental health issues that had gone untreated. What they found instead made the hair on the back of their neck stand up. Joseph Edward Corcoran wasn't new to murder. 5 years earlier, in 1992, when he was just 17 years old, he had been accused of killing his own parents, Jack and Catherine Corcoran, in their home near Ball Lake in Steuben County. Both had been shot to death with a 12-gauge shotgun. The weapon was never recovered. Joseph had allegedly offered a classmate $200 and a shotgun to carry out the killings. The motive? His parents were too strict. They had burned his music tapes. They had sold a car he believed should be his. They had forced him to go to church. There had been a trial. Witnesses testified. Evidence was presented. But in the end, the jury said there wasn't enough proof. No weapon, no confession, just suspicions and circumstantial connections. On November 12, 1992, Joseph Edward Corcoran walked out of that courtroom a free man, technically innocent, legally untouchable, but everyone who had followed the case knew the truth in their gut. He had done it. He had killed his parents and gotten away with it. The case remained open but cold. No other suspects were ever identified. No new evidence ever emerged. Jack and Catherine Corcoran's murders went into the unsolved files, another tragedy without closure, another injustice without resolution, and Joseph went back to his life, moving in with his brother James, retreating into himself, building his arsenal in the attic, waiting. For the detectives standing in that house in July 1997, looking at 4 fresh bodies and the evidence of Joseph's guilt, the realization hit like a physical blow. If the system had worked differently in 1992, if that jury had voted guilty instead of not guilty, if Joseph had been held accountable for his parents' murders, these 4 men would still be alive. James would still be working and laughing with friends. Robert would be planning his wedding to Kelly. Timothy and Douglas would be home with their own families, living their ordinary, beautiful lives. Instead, the system had given Joseph a second chance, and he had used it to kill again, this time with even more brutality and calculation. The acquittal hadn't rehabilitated him. It had emboldened him. It had taught him that he could get away with murder, that paranoia could be indulged, that violence could be the answer to his twisted perceptions of threat and betrayal. One of the investigators, a veteran with 20 years on the force, stood in that attic surrounded by weapons and war plans and asked the question that would haunt everyone involved in the case. He'd already beaten the system once. Should that have been a warning sign? Should someone have been watching him? Should there have been surveillance or mandatory mental health treatment or some kind of intervention that could have prevented this? The questions had no good answers. You can't surveil someone who's been acquitted. You can't force treatment on someone who hasn't been convicted of a crime. The law protects the innocent even when everyone suspects they're guilty. And so Joseph had been free to build his arsenal, free to feed his paranoia, free to plan the murders of 4 men who never saw it coming. The name Joseph Edward Corcoran had haunted Indiana once before, whispered in connection with an unsolved double homicide that everyone knew in their bones he had committed. Now it would haunt Indiana again, forever linked to one of the most brutal and calculating mass murders in the state's history. A name that represented the darkest failure of the justice system. A name that proved sometimes giving someone the benefit of the doubt means giving them the opportunity to kill again. And in the holding cell where Joseph sat after his arrest, he reportedly did something that confirmed what investigators had suspected all along. He bragged about killing his parents. 5 years of keeping that secret, 5 years of walking free while his victims lay in their graves, and now that he had nothing left to lose, the truth finally came out. Not in a court of law, not under oath, but in the casual boasting of a man who had gotten away with murder once and knew he wouldn't get away with it again. The evidence was overwhelming this time. The bodies were undeniable. The weapon was recovered. Joseph had confessed to the neighbor before police even arrived. There would be no acquittal this time. No walking free, no second chance to kill again. Within 48 hours, Joseph Edward Corcoran was formally charged with 4 counts of murder with aggravating circumstances. The trial that would determine whether he lived or died was set to begin. But for the families of James, Robert, Timothy, and Douglas, and for the family of Jack and Catherine Corcoran, who had never received justice, one question remained. How many lives could have been saved if the system had seen the monster growing in that attic before he pulled the trigger? Before Joseph became a killer of 4, he was accused of being a killer of 2. And those 2 were the people who gave him life, his own parents. Jack and Catherine Corcoran were found dead in their Ball Lake home on April 14, 1992, just 4 days before Joseph's 17th birthday. Both had been killed with a 12-gauge shotgun, blasted at close range in the early morning hours. The weapon was never recovered. The crime was never solved. But everyone knew who did it. Jack Corcoran was a former Marine, a strict disciplinarian who ran his household like a military barracks. He was a heavy drinker who believed in harsh punishment. Young Joseph remembered being whipped with a belt, forced to drink whiskey as a child, subjected to the kind of discipline that crossed the line from strict to abusive. Catherine was a housewife who struggled with depression and obsessive behavior. Joseph was closest to her, often left alone in her care while his father worked, and his siblings escaped the suffocating home. But as Joseph grew into his teenage years, the relationship soured. His parents became, in his mind, tyrants who controlled every aspect of his life. They burned his music tapes because they didn't approve of what he listened to. They sold a car he believed would eventually be his. They forced him to attend church and youth group activities when all he wanted was to be left alone. To most people, these sound like normal parenting decisions. To Joseph, they felt like persecution, like warfare. So he allegedly decided to end the war. According to evidence that emerged during his investigation, 16-year-old Joseph offered a classmate $200 and a shotgun to murder his parents. When that plan apparently fell through, the killings happened anyway. Jack and Catherine were found shot to death. Their teenage son became the prime suspect. Joseph was indicted for their murders. There was a trial. His siblings, including his brother James and sister Kelly, defended him fiercely. They stood by him. They testified for him. They believed in his innocence, or at least wanted to believe. The prosecution presented their case, but without the murder weapon, without a confession, without ironclad proof, the jury faced reasonable doubt. On November 12, 1992, 17-year-old Joseph Edward Corcoran walked out of that courtroom acquitted. Not guilty in the eyes of the law, free to go home, free to live his life, free to kill again. The jury let him walk. 5 years later, 4 more bodies. After the acquittal, Joseph's mind began its final descent into darkness. He moved in with his brother James, but he wasn't the same person anymore. He became a ghost in his own life. No friends, no job that lasted, no social connections. He spent most of his time locked in his room or hidden away in the attic, the only space he could control completely. The attic became his kingdom, his fortress, his tomb. Up there, surrounded by weapons and war manuals, he could be whoever he wanted to be, powerful, prepared, protected from a world he believed was constantly threatening him. The isolation fed his paranoia, and the paranoia fed his isolation, a vicious spiral that pulled him deeper into madness with each passing day. Experts would later diagnose him with paranoid schizophrenia, a severe mental illness where the brain can't distinguish between reality and delusion. He heard voices that weren't there. He believed people were plotting against him when they weren't. He experienced threats that existed only in his fractured mind. In 1992, doctors had actually diagnosed him with prodromal schizophrenia, the earliest stage of the disorder. But his family was never told. No treatment was given. The illness was allowed to grow and consume him until the boy disappeared completely and only the monster remained. But here's the question that has haunted this case for decades and will continue to haunt it forever. Did his mental illness excuse what he did, or did it simply explain it? Joseph Corcoran knew how to plan. He knew how to collect weapons. He knew how to draw tactical diagrams and prepare for violence. He knew enough to move his 7-year-old niece away from the killing zone before he started shooting. He knew to walk calmly to the neighbor's house and report what he'd done. He knew the difference between right and wrong, even if his paranoid mind gave him twisted justifications for choosing wrong. So where's the line between mental illness and accountability? If someone's brain is broken, are they still responsible for the destruction they cause? Should society execute someone who hears voices and sees threats that don't exist? Or should we recognize that mental illness is real, that it destroys lives just as surely as bullets do, and that punishment without treatment is justice without mercy? Joseph's sister Kelly, who lost her parents and then lost her brother and her fiancé, now believes with absolute certainty that Joseph killed their parents in 1992. The 1997 murders changed everything. She went from his fierce defender to his accuser, from believing in his innocence to knowing his guilt. She's carried the weight of that realization for decades, knowing that her defense of him might have contributed to 4 more deaths 5 years later. But even she opposes the death penalty. Even she believes her brother was too mentally ill to be held fully accountable. Even she thinks the system failed him long before he failed everyone else. The uncomfortable truth is that Joseph Edward Corcoran was both victim and victimizer. He was failed by a system that acquitted him when evidence suggested guilt, that diagnosed him with mental illness but never treated it, that allowed him to stockpile weapons while his mind deteriorated. But he was also a calculating killer who planned murders, executed them without mercy, and destroyed families without remorse. So what's the answer? Where do we draw the line? When does mental illness become an explanation but not an excuse? When does accountability matter more than diagnosis? And how many lives could have been saved if someone, anyone, had recognized that the boy who killed his parents would grow into the man who killed his brother? These aren't easy questions. They don't have clean answers. But they're the questions we need to wrestle with if we're ever going to prevent the next Joseph Corcoran from building an arsenal in an attic while everyone looks the other way. The trial began in May 1999 at the Allen County Superior Court in Fort Wayne. The courtroom was packed with reporters, family members, and people who needed to understand how someone could execute 4 men in cold blood. On one side sat the prosecutors, armed with overwhelming evidence. On the other side sat 24-year-old Joseph Edward Corcoran, a man who looked more like a college student than a mass murderer, staring ahead with empty eyes. The prosecutor stood and delivered an opening statement that cut through every excuse and every defense like a blade. Joseph Corcoran didn't lose his mind. He kept it just long enough to pull the trigger 4 times. The words hung in the air, impossible to refute. The state presented their case with surgical precision. The arsenal found in Joseph's attic, the military tactical manuals with pages worn from repeated reading, the hand-drawn firing diagrams on the walls, the forensic trajectory reports showing exactly how each bullet had traveled, how each victim had fallen, how none of them had time to react or defend themselves. The evidence painted a picture of premeditation so clear, so calculated, that it was almost artistic in its brutality. But the defense attorney faced an impossible task. His client was guilty. Everyone knew it. Joseph had confessed at the scene. The bodies were undeniable. The only hope was to save him from death row by proving he was too mentally ill to be held fully accountable. Then Joseph made everything harder. He rejected the insanity defense. He didn't want to be called crazy, even if it might save his life. He insisted on representing part of his own case, convinced in his paranoid mind that only he could explain his actions properly. Court-appointed psychiatrists examined him and confirmed what everyone suspected. Severe paranoid schizophrenia, a mind that couldn't distinguish reality from delusion, a brain that created threats where none existed. But they also concluded something that sealed his fate. Despite his mental illness, Joseph Edward Corcoran understood the difference between right and wrong at the time of the crime. He was competent to stand trial. He knew what he was doing when he pulled that trigger. Then came the moment that showed just how deeply his illness had twisted his perception of reality. During plea negotiations, Joseph made a proposal so bizarre that it left everyone in the courtroom speechless. He would accept a deal to avoid the death penalty, but only under one condition. The state would have to sever his vocal cords. He was convinced he suffered from a speech disorder that made him say things against his will. He believed his own voice was betraying him, speaking words he didn't mean, confessing to things he wanted hidden. In his fractured mind, cutting out his vocal cords was the only way to stop the betrayal. The prosecution dismissed the request immediately. There would be no deal, no mercy, no compromise. The trial moved forward. The defense presented mitigating factors: Joseph's cooperation with police after the shooting, the fact that he had protected his 7-year-old niece from witnessing the murders, his young age, his documented mental illness, his lack of any prior criminal record, conveniently ignoring that he had been acquitted of killing his parents 5 years earlier. None of it mattered. The jury saw through every excuse. They saw the planning, they saw the arsenal, they saw 4 dead men who had trusted him, and they saw a killer who knew exactly what he was doing, even if his reasons were rooted in delusion. He knew what he was doing, and he wanted to die for it. On May 22, 1999, after deliberating, the jury returned with their verdict: guilty on all 4 counts of murder. The courtroom remained silent. No gasps. No reactions. Just the weight of inevitable justice settling over everyone present. 2 days later, on May 24th, the same jury made their sentencing recommendation: death, unanimous. 12 people looked at Joseph Edward Corcoran and decided that he should die for what he had done, that his mental illness didn't excuse 4 executions, that mercy had no place in a case this brutal. On August 26, 1999, Judge Fran Gall read the final sentence in a packed courtroom. Her voice was steady and clear. For the murders of James Corcoran, Robert Scott Turner, Timothy Bricker, and Douglas Stillwell, this court sentences you to death. There were no outbursts, no tears, no dramatic reactions. Just silence. Heavy, suffocating silence. Joseph heard the sentence without moving a muscle. With the same eerie stillness he had shown when sitting on his porch, waiting for police to arrive on that July afternoon 2 years earlier. His face showed nothing. No fear, no relief, no emotion at all. His fate was sealed. 25 years on death row awaited him. Appeals would be filed and denied. Courts would review his case over and over, but the outcome would never change. Joseph Edward Corcoran had killed 4 men, and the state of Indiana had decided he would die for it. And in that moment, sitting in a courtroom surrounded by people who would never understand what went on inside his broken mind, Joseph had gotten exactly what he wanted: death. The only escape from the voices, the paranoia, the endless war raging inside his head. He would wait 25 years for it, but it would come. And he would face it the same way he faced everything else, with empty eyes and perfect silence. 25 years is a long time to wait to die. For most people on death row, those years are spent fighting for life, filing appeal after appeal, clinging to hope that some court somewhere will overturn their sentence. Joseph Edward Corcoran was different. He wanted to die. And the system, ironically, kept forcing him to live. In 2003, just 4 years into his death sentence, Joseph did something that stunned his attorneys in the courts. He formally requested that all appeals be withdrawn. "Stop fighting for me," he told them. "I want this over. Let me die." But before anyone could grant that request, the law required evaluation. 3 different mental health specialists were brought in to examine Joseph independently. They needed to determine whether he was mentally competent enough to make such a profound decision about his own life. What they found was a mind in complete deterioration. Joseph's paranoid schizophrenia, first diagnosed in his teenage years and left largely untreated, had progressed into full-blown psychosis. During the interviews, he made claims that revealed just how fractured his reality had become. The guards were torturing him, he insisted, with ultrasound machines. Invisible weapons that only he could detect. Sounds that penetrated his skull and scrambled his thoughts. Technology designed specifically to break him down from the inside. None of it was real. The ultrasound machines didn't exist. The torture was happening only in his diseased mind, where paranoia had grown so thick that he couldn't distinguish between reality and delusion anymore. The specialist documented everything: severe paranoid schizophrenia, chronic auditory hallucinations, persecutory delusions, a textbook case of serious mental illness. But then came the conclusion that would seal his fate. Despite his broken mind, despite the voices and the invisible torture devices, the doctors agreed on one critical point. Joseph Edward Corcoran understood the difference between right and wrong. He comprehended what execution meant. He was legally competent to waive his appeals and choose death. So the question became unbearably complex. He wanted death. The system kept giving him life through mandatory appeals. Was that justice, or was that cruelty? When someone is so mentally ill they believe in invisible torture machines, should we honor their request to die? Or should we recognize that the request itself comes from a diseased mind that can't be trusted to make rational decisions? The courts chose what they believed was mercy. They kept the appeals process going despite Joseph's wishes. And for over 2 decades, the legal marathon continued whether he wanted it to or not. The Indiana Supreme Court reviewed his case 7 separate times. Each time they examined the evidence, the trial procedures, the sentencing phase, looking for any error that might warrant overturning his conviction or death sentence. Each time they found none. The conviction stands, the sentence stands. 3 times Joseph's case reached the United States Supreme Court, the highest legal authority in the nation. 3 times they declined to intervene. No constitutional violations, no procedural errors significant enough to warrant a new trial or resentencing. The lower courts had done their job correctly, even if the outcome felt uncomfortable. In 2016, the final appeal was closed. After 17 years of legal reviews, every possible avenue had been exhausted. There were no more courts to petition, no more judges to convince, no more arguments to make. Joseph Edward Corcoran would die by lethal injection, just as the jury had decided back in 1999. But death row changes people in different ways. Some find religion, some maintain innocence, some become advocates for prison reform. Joseph became something else entirely. According to reports from fellow inmates and prison staff, he began bragging about killing his parents back in 1992, the murders he had been acquitted of, the double homicide that everyone suspected he had committed but couldn't prove. Now, with nothing left to lose and death waiting at the end of a certain timeline, the secret he had kept for over 3 decades started spilling out. He had done it. He had killed Jack and Catherine Corcoran. He had gotten away with it, and he wanted people to know. Whether this was confession or continued delusion, whether he was finally being honest or his schizophrenia was creating false memories, no one could say for certain. But the families who had always suspected now had something that felt like confirmation, even if it could never be prosecuted. The years crawled by. Death row at Indiana State Prison in Michigan City became Joseph's entire world. A 6 by 8 foot cell, 23 hours a day of isolation, 1 hour of recreation alone in a concrete yard. Meals passed through a slot in the door. No physical contact with other human beings. For someone with paranoid schizophrenia, this isolation was its own form of torture, feeding the delusions and voices that already plagued him. Indiana, meanwhile, had stopped executing people. The last execution before Joseph's took place in 2009. For 15 years, death row inmates lived in limbo, their sentences legally valid but practically suspended. The state cited various reasons: problems with execution drugs, legal challenges to lethal injection protocols, changing public opinion about capital punishment. Whatever the reasons, the death chamber stayed empty for over a decade. Then on September 11, 2024, everything changed. The Indiana Supreme Court signed an execution warrant. Joseph Edward Corcoran would be put to death on December 18, 2024. After 25 years of waiting, after 15 years of statewide execution moratorium, Indiana was about to kill again, and Joseph would be the first. The decision reignited every debate about capital punishment. Mental illness advocates pointed to Joseph's documented schizophrenia and asked how a state could ethically execute someone so clearly mentally ill. Prosecutors pointed to the four bodies, the premeditation, the arsenal in the attic, and said mental illness doesn't erase accountability for mass murder. Victims' families were divided. Some wanted closure through execution. Others, like Joseph's own sister Kelly, who had lost her fiancé Robert in the shooting, opposed the death penalty entirely. The date was set. The countdown began, and somewhere in his cell, Joseph Edward Corcoran finally got what he had been asking for since 2003. Permission to die. After a quarter-century of waiting, after countless court reviews and appeals he never wanted, after years of deteriorating mental health and isolation, the state was finally going to grant his original request. Indiana was preparing to kill again after 15 years of silence. The execution chamber was being readied. The drugs were being prepared. The witnesses were being selected. And the man at the center of it all, the man whose mind had been broken long before he ever pulled a trigger, waited in his cell for December 18th to arrive. The end he had wanted, the death he had chosen, the justice or cruelty that no one could quite agree on. December 18th, 2024, arrived like any other winter morning in northern Indiana, cold, dark, and unforgiving. But inside Indiana State Prison in Michigan City, the weight of history pressed down on everyone present. After 15 years without executing anyone, after 15 years of empty death chambers and suspended sentences, the state was about to kill again. And the man waiting in a holding cell, 49 years old now, gray-haired and weary from 25 years of isolation, was ready to die. Joseph Edward Corcoran had been waiting for this moment since 2003, when he first asked the courts to stop fighting for his life. Now finally, after decades of mandatory appeals he never wanted, after countless legal reviews he actively opposed, after years of voices in his head telling him the guards were torturing him with invisible ultrasound machines, the end had come, not as punishment he feared, as relief he craved. For his final meal, Joseph made a request so simple it was almost heartbreaking. Ben & Jerry's ice cream, nothing else. No elaborate dinner, no specific flavor even recorded. Just ice cream, the last taste of something sweet before darkness. In the hours before midnight, Reverend David Littell arrived at the prison. He had known Joseph since childhood, back when Joseph was just a boy struggling in a strict household with parents who would later be found dead. The Reverend had watched Joseph grow from troubled teenager to accused killer to acquitted defendant to mass murderer to death row inmate. Now he would watch him die. They sat together in the holding cell. Reverend Littell prayed. Joseph listened, or perhaps didn't, his mind occupied by the delusions that had plagued him for 3 decades. They shared long silences that felt heavier than words. What do you say to someone about to be executed? What comfort exists when both of you know death is minutes away? Outside the prison walls, approximately 30 protesters stood in the December cold. Their breath formed clouds in the freezing air. Some held candles that flickered against the darkness. Others clutched handmade signs opposing capital punishment. They prayed for Joseph's soul. They prayed for the victims' families. They prayed that Indiana would stop killing in the name of justice. Their voices rose into the night, quiet but persistent, a chorus of mercy that the state would not hear. Notably absent from the prison that night was Kelly Corcoran, Joseph's sister. She had lost so much to her brother's violence, her fiancé Robert, her brother James, her sense of safety, her belief in Joseph's innocence from the 1992 murders of their parents. She had every reason to want closure, to want to witness justice for the man who had destroyed her family twice over. But Kelly refused to attend. She opposed the death penalty entirely, even for her brother, even after everything he had done. She believed his paranoid schizophrenia was real and severe, that executing a severely mentally ill person wasn't justice. It was state-sanctioned killing of someone whose broken mind made him only partially responsible for his actions. Whether you agree with her or not, her absence spoke volumes about the impossible moral calculations this case forced on everyone involved. The clock crept toward midnight. Inside the execution chamber, witnesses took their seats. A reporter from the Indiana Capitol Chronicle, specifically chosen by Joseph as one of his witnesses, sat watching. Prison officials, Department of Correction representatives. No family members for Joseph, no family members for the victims either. This wasn't their kind of closure. At 12:01 a.m., the protocol began. Joseph was led into the stark white execution chamber and strapped to the gurney. IVs were inserted into his arms. Reverend Littell was allowed to stand beside him, a final mercy. The witnesses watched through the glass partition, separated from death by inches and a lifetime of philosophical debates about justice, punishment, and mercy. Someone asked Joseph if he had any final words, any last statement, any message for the world or apology for the families or declaration of remorse. 25 years to think about what he might say in this moment. His response was quintessentially Joseph. Flat, empty, tired. Not really, let's get this over with. The same words, essentially, that he'd spoken to the neighbor on July 26, 1997, after killing 4 men. The same exhaustion, the same resignation, the same sense that life, whether his own or others, was just something to get through, to finish, to end. At approximately 12:36 a.m., the lethal injection began, a single dose of pentobarbital, the powerful sedative that would shut down his central nervous system, stop his breathing, and silence his heart. The same drug used to euthanize animals, the same chemical cocktail that would end consciousness within seconds and life within minutes. Joseph's eyes closed, his breathing slowed. The voices in his head, the ones telling him about ultrasound torture, about guards plotting against him, about secrets spilling from his mouth without his control, went quiet for the first time in decades. The paranoia that had consumed him since adolescence finally released its grip. The mental illness that had shaped every decision, destroyed every relationship, and driven him to murder 8 people across 2 decades ceased to matter. At 12:44 a.m. on December 18, 2024, doctors pronounced Joseph Edward Corcoran dead. 8 minutes after the injection began, 27 years, 4 months, and 22 days after he killed 4 men in a Fort Wayne living room. 32 years after he was acquitted of killing his parents. The witnesses filed out silently. The protesters outside continued their vigil. Reverend Lytle said prayers over the body of the boy he'd once known. And in the distance, beyond the prison walls and the December cold and the weight of it all, dawn began to break over Lake Michigan. Pink and orange light stretched across the horizon, indifferent to what had just happened, beautiful despite the ugliness. Joseph Edward Corcoran no longer belonged to the living. His body would be removed from the execution chamber, processed according to protocol, released or disposed of according to whatever arrangements had been made. His story was over, but the questions he left behind still do. Should we execute the severely mentally ill? Is paranoid schizophrenia an explanation or an excuse? Does society become safer when we kill rather than imprison? What about the families? Do they get peace from watching someone die? Did justice happen in that chamber or just revenge? And what about the 1992 murders of Jack and Catherine Corcoran, never prosecuted, never solved, confessed to only in prison boasts that might have been delusion? Indiana had executed again after 15 years. The death chamber was no longer empty. The moral debates would continue in classrooms and courtrooms and late-night conversations. The victims' names: James Corcoran, Robert Scott Turner, Timothy Bricker, Douglas Stillwell, and yes, possibly Jack and Catherine too, would fade from public memory, while Joseph's name would be remembered as the man Indiana killed, the mentally ill mass murderer, the case that asked all the hardest questions and answered none of them satisfactorily. And somewhere, a 7-year-old girl who was now 34 years old, who had been placed in a room and told not to come out, who had heard sounds she couldn't understand and lost her father to her uncle's madness, woke up that morning knowing it was finally over. Whether that brought her peace or just different pain, only she could say. The sun rose, life continued, and the questions Joseph Edward Corcoran left behind remained, unanswered and unanswerable, hanging in the air like his final words. Let's get this over with. The Joseph Edward Corcoran case forces us to confront the questions we'd rather avoid, the uncomfortable truths, the moral complexities that don't fit neatly into categories of right and wrong, justice and mercy, punishment and compassion. Look at the pattern. In 1992, a 17-year-old boy was accused of killing his parents with a shotgun. The evidence pointed to him. The suspicions surrounded him. But the jury said there wasn't enough proof, so he walked free. 5 years later, in 1997, that same person killed 4 more people, this time with undeniable evidence and witnesses and a confession. 8 total victims across 2 decades if you count both crimes. 8 lives ended, countless others destroyed. The question screams at us, could this have been prevented? If that 1992 jury had voted differently, would James, Robert, Timothy, and Douglas still be alive today? Was the acquittal a failure of justice that enabled mass murder? Or was it the system working correctly, refusing to convict without proof beyond reasonable doubt? Even when suspicion ran deep, there are no good answers. Only the weight of what happened next. Then there's the mental illness debate, the one that splits people into irreconcilable camps. Was Joseph Corcoran sick or evil? The psychiatrist said both. Severe paranoid schizophrenia, hallucinations, delusions about ultrasound torture machines that didn't exist, a mind so broken it couldn't tell reality from nightmare, but also competent, aware of right and wrong, capable of planning, preparing, executing a massacre with military precision. So which is it? Do we execute someone whose brain creates invisible enemies? Someone who spent 25 years hearing voices that told him lies? Or do we say that mental illness doesn't erase accountability for pulling a trigger 4 times, for chasing a man through a kitchen and shooting him in the head, for destroying families because paranoia whispered in your ear? The uncomfortable truth is that both things can be true simultaneously. Joseph was severely mentally ill. Joseph also committed premeditated mass murder. His brain was diseased. His actions were monstrous. The illness explains without excusing. The accountability exists despite the diagnosis. And we're left wrestling with whether a society that executes the severely mentally ill is civilized or cruel. Indiana hadn't executed anyone in 15 years. From 2009 to 2024, death row inmates lived in limbo. Sentences legally valid but practically suspended. Then suddenly the state acquired pentobarbital, set an execution date, and killed Joseph Corcoran. Why restart now? Why him? Why end a decade-and-a-half moratorium with a man whose mental illness was documented and undeniable? The state said justice required it, that 7 reviews by the Indiana Supreme Court and 3 by the U.S. Supreme Court had validated the conviction and sentence, that the law demanded execution and the governor had a duty to carry it out. But others saw something darker, a political statement, a return to vengeance disguised as justice, the first execution becoming a spectacle, a message, a warning. And what about the victims' families? Did Joseph's execution bring them closure, or just reopen wounds that had scarred over after 27 years? James's family lost him in 1997. Robert's fiancée, Kelly, lost her future husband, and then watched her brother die by state order. Timothy's and Douglas's families have lived with absence for nearly 3 decades. Did watching Joseph die make any of it better? Did it heal anything? Or did it just add another death to the count, another body to the tragedy, another question mark hanging over whether any of this served a purpose beyond ritual? Kelly Corcoran Ernst, Joseph's sister who lost her fiancé to his violence, refused to attend the execution. She had forgiven him. She opposed the death penalty. She believed her brother's mental illness made executing him wrong, even after everything he'd done to her life. If she can find mercy, what does that say about the rest of us who demand blood? So here's the question that haunts this case and will continue to haunt it long after these words are read. Has justice been served? Or did we just execute a severely mentally ill man who should have been in a hospital, not on death row? Did society become safer by killing Joseph? Did the victims' families find peace? Or did we simply prove that violence begets violence? That the state can kill just like the criminals it condemns, and that sometimes there are no satisfying endings to stories that begin with tragedy? I don't have the answers. Neither does anyone else, really. We just have opinions shaped by our values, our beliefs about punishment and redemption, Our tolerance for moral ambiguity? Some of you will say Joseph got exactly what he deserved. Others will say we killed a sick man who needed treatment. Both positions have merit. Both miss something crucial. What I know for certain is this: 8 people are dead who should be alive. Joseph killed them, or was acquitted of killing 2 of them, while almost certainly being guilty. A justice system acquitted him once and executed him later. Mental illness destroyed a mind long before that mind destroyed lives. Families suffered losses no execution can remedy. And we're all left asking whether any of this had to happen, whether different choices at different moments could have saved everyone, whether justice and mercy can ever coexist when the crimes are this terrible and the circumstances this complicated. Drop your honest thoughts in the comments below. I read every single one, and I genuinely want to know where you stand. Do you think executing Joseph was justice or state-sanctioned killing of the mentally ill? Could the 1997 murders have been prevented if the 1992 trial had gone differently? Where's the line between accountability and compassion when severe mental illness is involved? Tell me what you think. If this case haunts you the way it haunts me, if you stayed with me through this entire story and you're still thinking about it hours or days from now, hit that subscribe button. Next week, we're diving into a case even more disturbing: the detective who became the killer, the man who swore to protect and serve but ended up on the other side of the bars. You won't want to miss it. This was Queen's Confessions, where the truth isn't always justice, and justice isn't always truth. Sometimes it's just the best we can do, with impossible choices and irreversible consequences. Stay safe out there.